Greetings and salutation, American Nationers. Today is our first full lesson for Chapter 11, The New Nation Grows and Prospers. And if you've gone through the introduction and vocabulary already, you kind of have an idea that in this chapter we're going to be talking about really the growth of the nation starting around 1790 through 1825 and some of the economic and the shifts that were going on in American society. And today, in Chapter 11, Section 1, we'll be talking about the Industrial Revolution. And this coincides with pages 330 to 335 in the textbook. But our essential question for today, the thing that we're really going to try and answer by the end of this lesson, is how did the first Industrial Revolution and technology change the lives of Americans and influence westward expansion? Now, last part we'll talk about a little bit, but we will kind of talk about that more in the future. But specifically, how did the first Industrial Revolution and changes in technology impact the lives of just normal, everyday Americans? And as you can also see, there's already audio recordings that have been done for this lesson, and the clue picture is of a spinning jenny, and if you don't know what a spinning jenny is, hopefully you will very, very soon. But first, let's look at our key terms that we'll be discussing today. Since today we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, our first term is Industrial Revolution. We'll also talk about the spinning jenny, capital, not like as in the Capitol building, but capital with an A, meaning money, which we've mentioned in the past, and a capitalist, a person who invests in a business in order to make a profit. We'll also discuss the factory system, and with the factory system, this idea of interchangeable parts. So these are all things we will be discussing in the very, very near future. But first, I have a very, very important question for you. Where do your clothes come from? Did you buy them in a store, or did you make them yourself? Right now, I have a bracelet that a friend of mine brought back from Africa that had been made by hand, but other than that bracelet, just about every item on my body right now was purchased from a store or from an online store, but it was something that I didn't make myself. But where do the stores get their clothes? Chances are most, if not all, of your clothes were mass-produced somewhere. You can still get handmade goods like that bracelet, or I have a hat and a scarf that my sister made for me, and they are awesome. But handmade goods take a long time to make, and if you try to buy handmade stuff, it's generally more expensive. So for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how a social and economic revolution that started in Great Britain would eventually make its way across the sea and affect American life. This wasn't a political revolution, but a complete change in the way that goods were made and produced, which I alluded to before. But before we get into that, let's look at what life in America was like before this revolution in industry, or Industrial Revolution, came to be.
Before the Industrial Revolution began in England around the year 1760, the way most people lived in Europe and America was very different from how they live today. 9 out of 10 people lived in rural areas. There was a large, mostly poor lower class, a small, rich upper class, and not much of a middle class. Rural people raised most of their food on small farms, and they didn't have to leave home each day to work at their jobs. Back then, there were no electric lights, no movies, no telephones, no recorded music, and no cars. Ordinary people used their hands to make most of the things they needed. They had no reason to own a clock, since their lives were tuned to the rising and setting of the sun. The world was pretty quiet before the Industrial Revolution because there were no machines for rapid transportation to fill the air with noise. Without these devices, people didn't travel much. Consequently, except for their own villages, they knew very little about the world in which they lived. The pace of life was much slower before the Industrial Revolution because people had to walk or use horses to move from place to place. There was no public education, so few people could read and write. And due to poor nutrition and living conditions, they didn't live nearly as long as people do today.
The Industrial Revolution begins. Now, the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain in about the mid-1700s and moved across the Atlantic to America in the early 1800s. And like we said before, this was not a revolution like the American Revolution or the French Revolution with gunfire and armies battling each other, but it was a revolution in that it was a change in the way that goods were produced. And it all started with James Hargreaves' 1764 invention, the spinning jenny. And it's spinning jenny, jenny. Those are just an abbreviation for the word engine. So it wasn't really named after someone named Jenny. And the spinning jenny, which we are looking at right here, was a machine that could spin several threads at a time into a piece of cloth. And before this, spinning wheels, like this one, were used that could only do one thread at a time. And eventually, these looms would be powered by water, and new inventions would continue to speed up the process of making cloth. Now, let's take a second to think about how people got their goods before this. Now, most cloth had been made in the home or made by hand, or both, but increases in technology led to the development of mills and factories in order to try and increase the output. Factories would be built to house these very large machines, and generally they were built next to a river because those looms, they used the river as a power source. And factories, to get started, required capital or money in order to be set up, which was supplied by capitalists. And a capitalist is a person who invests a share of his or her money in a business in order to make a profit on the eventual success of that business. And this developed into a factory system where workers and machinery were brought together in one place to produce goods. And these workers generally earned a daily or weekly wage and had to work a set number of hours per day. And this seems normal to us now, going to work, working for a set number of hours, and then going home. But back then, this was way, way out of the ordinary. Most Americans at this time were farmers, and as a farmer, you have to work every day in order to keep your crops alive. There's no such thing as an 8-hour workday because you would wake up, start working, and work all day until the job was done, even if it took all day. If the work doesn't get done, then the crops die and your family goes hungry. So working from sunrise to sunset was really part of the culture, and it still is a part of the culture in many, many places. So with that in mind, this new idea of producing only one type of goods and working all day just on that product was just revolutionary. So to sum it up so far, and this is a sigma, which in math and science is a symbol meaning to sum up. So to sum it up, advances in technology led to an easier way to produce textiles, and textiles are products made from cloth. And these machines were very large, so they required very large buildings as well as some sort of power source, a flowing river or a waterfall that could turn a water wheel. And since every person in America didn't live near a river or a waterfall, large factories were built to house these machines, and workers would come to this factory instead of working out of their homes.
In the 1760s, two new machines, the spinning jenny and the water frame, caused a revolution in the textile industry because both machines markedly sped up the process of making thread for weaving. These machines were adapted to use the power of flowing water, or hydraulic power. This means that the motion of the water would turn a wheel that was connected by a complicated system of pulleys and belts used to run the machines. Another machine, called the spinning mule, was developed later in the 1700s. When it was hooked up to water power, just one person could do the work of 3,000 hand spinners. The new textile machines were extremely efficient at producing the fine thread needed to make high-quality cloth, and they caused the cottage spinning industry to collapse soon after they were introduced. A little later, mechanized power looms were developed that used water power instead of human muscle power to weave thread into cloth. One important invention adapted to power weaving from hand looms was a mechanized version of the flying shuttle seen here. This was a special device used to rapidly weave across thread through the webs of thread on the loom. On power looms, this process took place at an incredible speed when compared to doing it by hand. It is not surprising that the much more efficient power looms rapidly ended the cottage weaving industry. In England in 1811, unemployed home textile workers, called the Luddites, got so angry about losing their jobs that they rioted and tried to destroy the new textile machines.
So this new way of mass-producing textiles was a secret. It had been developed in Great Britain, and they wanted to hold on to that secret because they didn't want other nations and other people to copy their machines or their tactics. I mean, they have this new way of producing things that they could do it much faster and much cheaper, so they wanted to hold on to that. But in 1789, this man, Mr. Samuel Slater, who was a skilled mechanic in a British textile mill, left Britain for America. And if anyone is going to be able to replicate a way that a factory works and operates, it's probably going to be the mechanic, the guy that knows how to fix all the machines. So to avoid getting caught by British officials, he didn't bring any plans with him to America. Because, like I said, Great Britain wanted to hold on to these ways of mass-producing textiles, so you weren't allowed to take plans out of the country. But what he did was he memorized the designs for all of the machines and the layout of all the mills. So yeah, he was a pretty intelligent dude. So Slater first stopped in New York City to try and sell his ideas, but he was soon visited by a Quaker capitalist named Moses Brown up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And we're looking actually at a picture of Slater's mill in Pawtucket, and it was here that he used his knowledge to improve the machinery that was already in Brown's mill. But soon he decided to branch off on his own, and in 1793 he built his own mill, and it became the first successful water-powered textile mill in the entire United States. And Slater's wife even got in on the action by developing a way of spinning thread so that it would become strong enough not to break on the spindles. And our next video is going to talk a little bit more about the trip to America that Slater took and some of the obstacles that he had to overcome.
The Industrial Revolution came to America mainly through two instances of what today would be called industrial espionage, or industrial spying. The spying occurred because the designs of English textile machines were carefully guarded secrets. They had brought England so much wealth that laws prohibited shipping the machines out of the country for fear that people might copy them. The first case of industrial spying took place sometime in the 1780s, when a man who had been employed at an English spinning factory named Samuel Slater memorized every detail of how the machines were built. He moved to the United States the year George Washington was elected president and had copies made of the English machines. Then he opened up a cotton spinning mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and put them to work. And by the beginning of the 19th century, 100 workers, mostly women and children aged 7 to 14, could be found laboring here at Slater's mill. The second case of espionage that brought the Industrial Revolution to America produced copies of English power looms which were first employed in the United States in the year 1814. Like the design of the spinning machine, the design of the power loom had been secretly memorized from English machines. And once America had power looms, it rapidly became an important textile manufacturing nation.
All right, so the Industrial Revolution starts in Great Britain and eventually makes its way to America by way of Mr. Samuel Slater. But now it's America's turn to start contributing to this new revolution. And a lot of it got its start with this man, American inventor and former schoolteacher Eli Whitney. And he helped the manufacturing industry with his creation of this idea of interchangeable parts. And specifically, this was to aid with the creation of muskets. Now, originally, guns were all handmade from the stock all the way to the end of the barrel. So each gun was a little bit different. And if it broke, a gunsmith had to create a new part that would fit specifically on that gun. So interchangeable parts would solve this problem because all of the machine-made parts would be alike. So if a trigger broke, then you could just buy a new trigger or new trigger housing instead of building one from scratch. So this idea of mass producing all of the parts that would fit into something soon spread into other goods, and other small workshops started growing into larger factories.
Besides inventing the cotton gin, Eli Whitney also came up with a new method of making things that helped revolutionize manufacturing. That was the idea of having interchangeable parts. Before the Industrial Revolution, each tool or machine was made by hand, one at a time. In fact, an important job of the blacksmith in pre-industrial times was to make replacement parts when a piece of equipment got broken, which was a very time-consuming process. For example, if a lock like this one stopped working, it was not possible to fix it with off-the-shelf parts, because each lock was one of a kind, and its parts could not be interchanged. The situation began to change in 1798, when Eli Whitney got an order from the U.S. government for 10,000 rifles that needed to be delivered in a very short period of time. To meet the deadline, he developed a method of manufacturing guns that were nearly identical to one another, so that a part for one rifle would work in any other rifle of the same kind. Making interchangeable parts not only sped up the manufacturing process for the rifles. If they failed to shoot, it made fixing them a lot quicker and easier to do. Whitney's method of using interchangeable parts was a big step forward in manufacturing, and eventually led to greatly increased production of almost all machine-made goods, while at the same time the blacksmith's job became much less important.
Now, in Chapter 10, a few lessons ago, we talked about the War of 1812, and that was, like I said, the war between the United States and Great Britain. It's almost like I sometimes refer to it as the American Revolution Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. But what the War of 1812 did was it forced America to produce more goods for itself because of the British blockade, and they weren't able to physically trade with other nations. And since the United States couldn't trade, they needed some way to get the goods that they had come to depend on. So Francis Cabot Lowell, a merchant from Boston, found a way to improve on current textile mills by combining spinning and weaving to turn cotton into finished cloth all under one roof. Previously, each process was done in a different factory. So you had the spinning factory, the weaving factory, the cloth making factory, where everything would come together. So he combined all of these into one factory. So Lowell really streamlined the process so that raw materials would enter one side of the factory and leave the other as a completely finished product. And this is actually a picture of Lowell's mill as it looks today. And notice the water source and how close the mill is in proximity to the river. So I want us to take a little parenthesis here, and I have a question for you. Think about the town that you live in. Think about physically where you live. Do you know why there is a town in that location? Well, the town that I grew up in, I've talked about it before, beautiful Uniontown, Pennsylvania, was originally a center for all of the coal mines in the area. And the National Road actually ran right through Uniontown, and we'll talk about the National Road in Section 2. And it went right through my town to the mills up in Pittsburgh. And Uniontown became kind of a central location for all of the coal mines in the area. And at the time, coal mining was a huge industry in that section of Pennsylvania, West Virginia. So the town grew because the miners needed workers, and the workers needed a place to live, so they moved to Uniontown, and slowly but surely the town grew and grew. So, all right, back to Lowell. This is similar to what was happening at this time in these early manufacturing centers in New England. We've talked about this before, but a lot of these manufacturing centers were up in New England, up in the northern part of the country. So these factories, including Lowell's textile factory, attracted workers because they offered a fair wage and more security than working in a small shop or working on a small farm. And as workers came, towns grew around these factories, and some eventually grew into much larger urban centers. So mill owners in Massachusetts and other areas hired mostly women and children. Why? Well, because they could pay them less than they could pay men. Plain and simple. Boys and girls as young as 7 years old worked in factories, and their small sizes actually put them at an advantage because they could squeeze around these huge machines and replace parts when necessary. And even though that's really looked down upon today in America, you really need to remember that America at this time was a nation of farmers, and children were expected to work hard. And often these wages that the children earned were really needed to help support the family as a whole.
When the Industrial Revolution began in England, the earliest textile factories employed many young children and paid them almost nothing. But that changed in America because by the mid-1800s, 8 out of every 10 workers in the textile factories were unmarried women, between the ages of 15 and 30. Most of them had left behind quiet lives on isolated farms for the adventure of working in a city and earning a steady wage. The conditions were not good in the textile factories, but they did improve over time. The machines tended to be extremely loud and dangerous to operate. The hours were long. The work was quite monotonous, and the air in the factories was filled with tiny bits of fiber that damaged the workers' lungs. The wages were low as well. The mill girls, as they were called, earned less than $3 for putting in a 6-day, 60-hour work week, while men got $1 more a week for doing the same jobs. The lives of the mill girls were almost completely controlled by the factories where they worked. For example, right across the street from this textile factory are the company-owned boarding houses where they slept and ate their meals. Here, the girls were carefully supervised and followed a strict curfew, but they were provided with respectable surroundings that were often more comfortable than those they had known back on the farm. However, as the 19th century rolled on, unskilled factory jobs began to be filled more and more often by recent immigrants to America instead of farm girls. Such jobs provided many immigrant families with a reliable income with which to start their new lives.
So because so many people were leaving farms to go work in factories, these cities started to grow and expand pretty rapidly. And this movement from rural or country to urban city is known as urbanization. And this is a slow but pretty steady process. From 1800 to 1850, the percent of the American population that lived in cities grew from 6% to 15%. And this doesn't seem like a lot, but that is a fair amount of the population. But it wouldn't really be until the 1920s that more Americans would live in cities than in rural areas. But the move to city life was definitely starting at this point. For example, let's look at these pictures of how Chicago, Illinois changed from 1820 to 1854. 1820, population 15. 1854, population 55,000. So that's a pretty significant jump in 34 years. 15 people to 55,000, that's pretty significant. And as the factory systems grew, so did the cities, obviously, but this growth also met with problems. Cities were dirty, had no sewers, and people just threw garbage into the streets. Ugh. Animals would roam the streets, and since the streets were not paved, they turned to mud every time there was a rainstorm. Mix that with the garbage in the street and the lack of sewage, yeah, cities were pretty disgusting. However, cities did offer some advantages. We're seeing the growth of museums, theaters, shops with the, quote, latest European fashions. And right here, this is a picture from the latest European fashions of the 1800s, and stores that sold fancy goods. You could find goods in these growing cities that you could not find anywhere else in the country. So as the cities grew, culture grew. And while some Americans were moving to cities to join the Industrial Revolution, changes in technology also helped to aid westward expansion we will talk about in the next lesson. So to kind of sum everything up that we talked about today, we have some causes and effects of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. On the causes side, British ideas for machines arrived in the United States, and the War of 1812, Britain stops United States trade, so Americans are forced to produce more goods for themselves. These were some of the causes to the significant growth in industry in the United States. Some of the effects of that: factory systems spread throughout the northeastern United States. As people moved closer to factories, these cities started to spring up and grow. And growing cities had problems of crowding and disease, but they also had some good things going on as well. So, Industrial Revolution, causes, effects. That leads us directly into our assignment for today. So now that we've gone through the lesson, our assignment is to look at the statement and write one cause for why this happened and one effect from the event for each of these 5 events. So think of this as a before and after. So I'll give you an example from my own life. The statement is, Mr. Huebner went to college. The cause for that is, I wanted to become a teacher, or excuse me, he wanted to become a teacher. And the effect, he was hired at PALCS to teach the most awesome class ever, American Nation. So the statement is that I went to college. The cause for that, or the before, is because I wanted to become a teacher. And the effect of going to college is that I was hired here at PALCS to become your American Nation teacher. So you can either type your answers into a Word or LibreOffice document, and if you're going to do that, please include the statements, or you may write them out by hand, scan that, or take a picture of it, save it as a JPEG, and submit that to me. And on the off chance that your scanner is broken, take a picture with a digital camera, or you can type your answers directly into the text box below, or you can record yourself using the Red 5 recorder and just state the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid-1700s, here is a cause, and here is an effect. And so each cause and effect is worth 1 point, so this assignment is worth 10 points total. And let's look at these statements. Statement number 1, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the mid-1700s. Give me 1 cause and 1 effect. Number 2, Samuel Slater memorized the design of the machines in British textile mills. Number 3, Eli Whitney invented machines that could manufacture identical parts. Number 4, textile mills hired young women and children. And number 5, the urban, or city, population in America grew from 6% in 1800 to 15% by 1850. And remember, for each of these statements, you need to give me a cause for that statement and an effect that came from that statement or from that event. A cause for the event and an effect from the event. All right, if you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.